Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be discussing the importance of standing up for Israel in Scotland. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's guest is all the way from Scotland. He's my good friend, Sammy Stein. He is the chairman of Glasgow Friends of Israel. Sammy, this seems to be an annual event, but an absolute pleasure to have you back on the Middle East Report.
Thank you, Simon, very much, and I'm delighted to be here again and have this conversation with you.
Absolutely, because what's happening in Scotland regarding Israel is so important. So I also want to thank you for giving me the opportunity last year to be one of your guest speakers at your annual conference, which was wonderful. It was wonderful to see so many of our viewers there and so many supporters of Israel. And it was a very, very good conference, and he did a great job. The
most wonderful thing about that is that last year was our 5th conference, and we're now working on our next one, which is going to be our 6th conference. And I can't believe how time's flown, because when we started the group, people said, oh, you're not going to survive for more than a few weeks or more than a few months. And here we are now organising our 6th annual conference. And the support we get in Scotland and in Glasgow especially is incredible. And that's why we can keep and maintain our efforts in Glasgow.
Excellent. So a good Hebrew expression is kol hakavod.
Kol hakavod. Thank you.
To you. Excellent work. And Sammy, you always have an interesting personal story, because you like to say that you're a Palestinian. You were born under the British Mandate of Palestine before the creation of the State of Israel. Do you want to share with our viewers again your kind of remarkable history and early years?
Yeah, well, my parents both came from Eastern Europe. My father came from Hungary and my mother came from Poland, and they met in Israel. And I was born in 1946, and as your viewers will know, Israel wasn't established until 1948, and therefore when I was born a Palestinian. I was born a Jewish Palestinian, and obviously there were Jewish Palestinians, there were Arab Palestinians, there were Christian Palestinians. And when I tell people today, when we meet in the stall or somewhere else, I was born a Palestinian, they get this very strange look over their face, because they believe that Palestinians are Arabs. But of course, they're not. Anybody that was born in Palestine was born a Palestinian. And therefore, I feel some sort of kinship, not necessarily with just Israel, but the fact that I was born a Palestinian, I feel some sort of kinship with the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people. And that's why we have the message, as we do at our stall, that we are pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. And of course, you can't have peace for one side, and therefore we support both sides in the conflict.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because going back to the period of the British Mandate, when the British were in control of that area, that the Jews were called the Palestinians, you had the Palestinian Post, and you would have had a Palestinian passport with the British Mandate.
Well, I was only 2, so I didn't have a passport, but the point that you make is correct. The Palestinian Post became the Jerusalem Post. The Palestinian Orchestra became the Israeli, I think, Philharmonic Orchestra, something like that. There was a bank that became an Israeli bank, and there was even a Palestinian brigade which fought against the Nazis and was made up of Jewish people only, as far as I know. So the Jewish brigade, the Palestinian brigade, was a Jewish organization. And people don't realize that most of the Palestinian organizations and entities then became Israeli rather than Palestinian.
And talking also about your history, you've recently discovered long-lost family in Brazil. Do you want to share this remarkable story with us?
Well, when I was living in Israel before I came to Scotland, I came to Scotland when I was 10 years old. And my father's family that came from Hungary, and quite a few of them lived in Israel. And then when I left to come to Scotland, some of them left as well and ended up in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. And I was very keen to try and find them. So I used a friend of mine in Glasgow who does genealogy. He was able to confirm that there is a family in Brazil with the name that I expected them to have. And he said, by the way, looks like a cousin of yours is actually living in London, which I found amazing. And so I looked her up on Google, and there she was, but it didn't tell me how to contact her. And it did tell me where she worked. So I sent a message to the place where she worked, and I said to them, please pass this message to Laura, who is my long-lost cousin, and I'd like to obviously meet her if I can. And they did pass the message to her, and 2 days later she phoned me, and she said, gosh, I didn't know how to contact you. I knew I had family in the United Kingdom, but I didn't know where you were, and I'm so pleased that you found me. And in fact, this afternoon, as I'm in London, I've arranged to meet her. And I've never met her before, and she will put me now in touch with her parents and grandparents and my whole family that I lost many, many years ago.
Amazing. That's an amazing story of uniting with your family there, Sammy. And Sammy, do you want to tell us about the work of Glasgow Friends of Israel? You said in the beginning part of the programme that you're approaching the celebration of your 6th anniversary, established in 2014. Why was Glasgow Friends of Israel established, and what's the remit of your organisation and what you do?
We have 3 main activities. One is the conference. One is we have a series of speaker evenings that we run in Glasgow. But the most important activity that we do is our street stall. We have a street stall in Buchanan Street in Glasgow, which we man every Saturday. And we've done that every Saturday for the last so many years. So here you see our street stall in Buchanan Street. And our focus and our slogan is pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. And we have a banner there, as you can see, of what one day we hope we will be able to see in Israel, where Arab children and Israeli children live together in peace. And what we do there, we talk to people in the street about the conflict, and we try and tell them a little bit more than most of them actually know, because most people know what they hear in the news, read in the newspapers, and what they hear on the news, but they don't really know much about the background of the conflict. And so we have a lot of material that we hand out to people to try and explain to them what the history of Palestine was and how Israel became an independent state and what's been happening ever since, and why there's still a conflict going on, and why it's so difficult to come to some sort of peace agreement with the Palestinians, because I don't believe the current Palestinian leaders want peace. There have been many opportunities for a peace agreement in the last 70 years, and the Palestinians have rejected every single one.
Including the recent deal of the century produced by President Trump, completely rejected out of hand by the Palestinian Authority.
And that's interesting, because Obama had a peace deal. And Obama was probably one of the worst presidents as far as Israel is concerned. And he brought out a peace plan, which they rejected, the Palestinians rejected. And now they've rejected the Trump peace plan. So what kind of peace plan are they looking for? I'm not absolutely sure. But the disappointing thing is that the peace plan by Trump is, I believe, merely a starting point. I expect the Palestinians to be unhappy with some of it, and Israelis to be unhappy with some of it. But you'd hope that the two sides would be able to sit down and use this as a basis for discussion and a basis for peace. And it's very, very sad that the Palestinians can't see their way to doing that.
Absolutely. So back onto the streets of Glasgow, what kind of reaction have you got to your store? And what's the general reaction from the Scottish public when they see you guys and your stand?
I think people were surprised when we first appeared on the street, because there's never been a stall in Glasgow which looks at the conflict in a balanced way. There have been other stalls in Buchanan Street and around the city centre which call themselves pro-Palestinian, but in fact they're not pro-Palestinian at all. They're anti-Israel stalls. So when you go and speak to people in those stalls, they would say everything they talk about is how terrible Israel is. They don't talk about the Palestinians themselves. And so I call them anti-Israel stalls, or Israeli haters stalls. And people were very surprised to see a stall which had the kind of banners that you've just seen and a slogan that says pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. And we even have some bunting on the stall, which is Palestinian bunting and Israeli bunting together. And people don't understand that. As they walk past the stall, they say, how could you have a stall which is pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. And I say, well, why would you not have a pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian stall? Because the only way to provide peace and to help peace is to actually support both people. And the reaction we get is fantastic. I mean, we do get the odd person going around and shouting and screaming and spitting and swearing, but I would say 95% of the people that walk past our stall are very supportive of what we do. They even just walk by and say, well done, or they give you a thumbs up. And many of them stop and talk about what we're wanting to tell them and talk about advocacy for peace in the Middle East.
Excellent. And what's been the reaction to some of the Christians that have seen your stand, and also some of those dedicated Christians you have working for your organisation as well?
It's absolutely wonderful when somebody comes up to me on the stall and says, well, of course you would support Israel. You're Jewish, and that's what Jewish people do. And I say, by the way, though, Thomas isn't Jewish, and Jean isn't Jewish, and Andrew isn't Jewish, and Elizabeth isn't Jewish. And they're all there on the stall with us. We would not be able to run our organisation without our Christian friends. We are not a religious organisation. We are a peace advocacy organisation. And all the people that come to our stall believe in peace for Israel. They all, what we say, have a heart for Israel. And it's absolutely critical that we have our Christian friends on the stall, without whom we could not do what we do.
Fabulous. And let's have a look now at this Scottish news report that featured Sammy when he was very much part of what was known as creating Israeli arts at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival back in 2017.
On paper, it doesn't sound controversial, but outside this Edinburgh Fringe event, there's flags tied to lampposts, slogans on the pavement, and police vans lined up in case of any trouble. It's been billed as an event to celebrate coexistence. Those demonstrating say that's a sham.
The organisers claim it's a peace festival and they're here to build bridges. We're arguing this is a justification in defence of Israeli wars and massacres of Palestinians in 2009 and 2014. And that far from building bridges, it's part of a project by the Israeli embassy, consistent over many, many years, to isolate Palestinians from any solidarity.
Conflict of all kinds can become wound into any discussion of this subject. The organisers say that's one of the problems they're trying to solve. They insist there's no Israeli government or embassy funding, but the protests follow them around. And they say in years past, it's crossed a line.
People are allowed to demonstrate for anything they believe in, and I would encourage them to do that peacefully, but not when they start harassing and haranguing people who are just going about their normal business. And in fact, what happened, they demonstrated against anyone that would come from Israel to the Fringe.
You could argue forever about the support and meaning behind each and every event, and perhaps not change many minds on either side, but you can also point towards solid facts, like the recent standoffs and violence over access to holy sites, and the controversial discussions about moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem. It sometimes makes a two-state solution seem further away than ever before. Ehab and Ora came from different sides of the conflict to marry and raise 3 children. They know events like this can't solve problems like that, but hope they can change people's perspective a little and encourage them to live together more peacefully.
We want a different future for our children and for all the people around us. And so this place here now, it's giving a little window for the world to see that people do want and can actually live together.
The event includes screenings of documentaries and artistic performances. The protesters plan to stay put. James Chain, STV News, Edinburgh.
And so important to have Israeli artists perform at the Edinburgh Festival known as the Fringe. Been very successful the last few years, particularly when there was Israeli representation, which your organisation and many others worked tirelessly to give Israel a platform at the Edinburgh Fringe.
I think you've obviously shown the second Shalom Festival. There was one the year earlier, which there were the most incredibly horrific demonstrations against the Shalom Festival. Shalom Festival is all about peace. It's all about artists, and there were people, there were Israeli people and there were Palestinian people, and the vile SPSC organization were demonstrating outside the hall we were in, and there were discussions and shows of the Holocaust in that Shalom Festival, and these horrific individuals were shouting and screaming and saying the most atrocious things about Israel. So the film we've just seen was from the following year, where we had the most incredible support from Police Scotland, and you saw some of the vans parked there with the police ready to actually protect us should that be necessary. But it was really nice to see that the Shalom Festival was on for 3 days, and these horrific individuals from the SPSC were only there for 4 hours. They realized that there's absolutely no point demonstrating against the event, where again we had artists from Israel and Palestinians, and we had a great time. And the individual you saw there is Michael Napier, who is the leader of the SPSC, who says he's not anti-Semitic. And we will maybe see a little bit more about that later on. But from my point of view, you judge a person by the company he keeps. And his organization is riddled with anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers. And if he's prepared to have them in the SPSC, he is by definition, as far as I'm concerned, an anti-Semite.
I mean, I experienced that myself back in 2016. The level of abuse, the demonstrations, calling, you've got blood on your tickets,
Exactly,
your child murderers, everything else. And the general atmosphere there was quite horrific. But you go inside and you go into the Shalom Festival, completely different atmosphere altogether. Now, one of the main reasons you're here today, Sammy, is to discuss what is the Stand Up to Racism march that takes place on Saturday, the 21st of March. Can you share with us what this is and why this is important to you and your organisation?
The Stand Up to Racism, there's an organisation called Stand Up to Racism. And as the name suggests, that's what they do. They run a number of events all around the country. They even had a Holocaust memorial event, which I attended. But one of the biggest events they have is the Stand Up to Racism March. And obviously, from a Friends of Israel point of view, we are against all types of racism, and especially anti-Semitism. So 3 years ago, a very small number of us attended the march in that march. And it was a surprise to the anti-Israel people that come around on this march. And because we just turned up and we participated. But the following year, they knew we were coming, and they prepared a reception committee for us, which basically tried to stop us marching. And I'm maybe going to show a film about that to see what it was like a couple of years ago.
Yes, so Sammy has provided these videos that show the hostility that him and those supporting Israel faced whilst being on the march against racism.
I voted for him because I want Everybody Lincolns! Go learn and pass! Lincolns, everybody! Lincoln! Everybody Lincolns! Don't let these racists marching our streets. This is our city. This is our city. This is our city. We won't let them march. We won't let them march through our streets, waving the racist flag of the racist Israeli state.
They move forward.
Palestine! No defenders of apartheid on the march.
There aren't any. There aren't any.
You're one.
There's not one.
They're one.
There's not one. There's
you
not
defend
one.
everything that
There's not
Israel
one.
does.
There's
You
not
do.
one.
We know it.
There's not one.
There is. It's an apartheid state worse than South Africa. Now that is the truth.
You should buy a
That
book.
is the truth.
You should buy
I
a
have
book.
a library of books, and it tells
It's
me
the wrong
all
books,
I
mate.
need to know.
Right, I'm going through. It's the wrong book.
You're not welcome here. Can't you get off? There is no your anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism.
You're
There's no
offended me.
Yeah.
And I want.
Well, you can go. Are you?
Excuse me.
Yes,
We're going to cross over. We're going to cross. We're going to cross.
I'm just done here, mate.
You're blocking my passage here, mate.
I don't care, mate.
And you're not.
And there we see, gives us some idea of the level of hostility shown against the supporters of Israel. Sammy, we saw two contrasting videos. Firstly, the very peaceful march which you and your organisation took part in, and the supporters of Israel standing up against anti-Semitism. And then we saw the supporters of the Palestinian Scottish Solidarity Campaign harassing and stopping you guys from marching any forward. What was that experience like, and what does that say about those that support the Palestinians up in Scotland?
We actually saw two marches there. The later video was from the 2018 march, when we were stopped by thugs and hooligans from participating in the march. And you could see that some of them were masked. They're actually too ashamed to show who they were, and therefore they decided they would hide their faces. And if you believe in a cause, as we do, you would think you'd be upfront about who you are and what you're doing. But these guys were too cowardly to actually show who they are. And one of the problems we had was that the police were completely unprepared for what was to happen. And you could see in the video that they were just standing around the police and not doing anything to help us and support us. And that made the march very, very difficult. And a march that was supposed to take 30 minutes actually eventually took 2 hours to get from the start to the end of that march. And a lot of people were very afraid, because some of our marchers were quite elderly, and they were terrified by the reception they got. But luckily we all arrived safely, and we had a meeting with the police after the march, and the police were very sorry for what had happened, because they were, as I said, unprepared. And they said the following year, which was 2019, it would be completely different, which it was. The police were out in force, and they were there to help us and support us, and they actually prevented the anti-Israel people from participating in the march. And we had the most wonderful time, and that beginning video that you saw was, despite the rain and despite the weather, we were walking along the march, and it was very peaceful. And as you suggested, the next march this year is going to be on the 21st of March, and we expect the police, the Scottish police, to be out in force and protect us and support us the way they did last year. And that's what is going to happen. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is I would like to invite people to walk with us on the march and fight against anti-Semitism. That's what it's about. So if people are around on the 21st of March on a Saturday and they can come and join us, please let us know on our normal email address, which is info@glasgowfoi.com, and let us know they would like to come on the march.
Obvious question, but this is taking place in Glasgow, right?
It is, yes.
Yeah, just want to double check that.
Yes.
And in terms of anti-Semitism, how much of a problem is it in Scotland?
I would say it's not as bad as it is in the rest of the UK. I mean, obviously there are pockets of anti-Semitism, and we know about the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign and the horrific anti-Semitism that they display. But in general, I would say, even looking at the Labour Party, which has been in the news a lot recently, the anti-Semitism in the UK Labour Party is much, much worse than it ever was in the Scottish Labour Party. And I don't think we have it as bad in Scotland as we do in the rest of the UK. But the thing is, we stand up against it. When we are at our stall every Saturday, we talk about anti-Semitism, we fight anti-Semitism, we oppose anti-Semitism, and therefore I think people tend not to come to our stall with anti-Semitic chants and anti-Semitic behaviour.
We've got another kind of shocking video to show you, and this is put on by the Scottish Communist Party in their opposition against Israel.
We're on the streets of Glasgow, a city of the British Empire, but out there a few thousand miles away, young women, young men, people of all ages are facing the Zionist monster. And who's responsible for creating the Zionist monster? I was there in Glenrothes a few summers ago, protesting against the Raytheon factory there. I was in the Witherspoons and I heard and read a lot about Balfour, who made put his name to the Declaration in 1917. Here's the deal on Balfour. He was known as Bloody Balfour for his repressive measures against the Irish during the land wars of the 19th century. He was the richest man in the British Empire when he was 21. He himself was a vile anti-Semite and saw the setting up of the colonial state as a way basically to rid Britain and Europe of Jewish people. There were no principles involved. Later on, British figures, generals who were involved in the suppression of the Palestinian people's rights in that area, they made it quite plain how they saw Israel. A little loyal Jewish ulster in the Middle East defending imperialist.
That gives you some idea of some of the level of hostility shown against Israel and against the Jewish people up in Scotland, with those organisers trying to stop the Jewish people and stopping the supporters of Israel taking part in the march against racism. We saw in that video, which was disturbing, the level of hostility as they tried to put a lot of pressure on the organisers to ensure that you and the Jewish community and others that support Israel and are fighting against Jew hatred were not able to attend the march against racism. But the reality is that it shows their ignorance, that they know nothing about Israel, because if you have a look at Israel today, Israel is such a multicultural society. It's a melting pot of Jewish communities from all over the world. 10% of Israel's population is Arab.
20, I think.
Maybe even 20%.
Yeah.
It's even higher than that. The Arab people themselves are able to serve on Israel's Supreme Court. They're able to have political representation, able to have their own freedom of expression, their own newspapers, which is unheard of in the rest of the Middle East. They need to get their facts right, don't they?
I think people are ignorant about what happens in Israel with regards to the Arab population. As I said, 20% of the Israeli population is Arab. They have a vote because they're all Israeli citizens, so they have the same rights as Israeli citizens have, because they are actually Israeli. And people tend to get mixed up between what happens in Israel proper and what may happen in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. People actually think that the Israeli army is still in Gaza. They don't realize that Israel withdrew from Gaza many years ago. And they just show an immense amount of ignorance about what's happening in the Middle East. And that's why when we are in the street, we try to explain to people what the real situation is and why Israel is such a wonderful place to live in. And hopefully it will stay like that for a long, long time.
Also lies about Israel's so-called occupation of Palestinian territories, because ever since 1996 there's been no Israeli presence in the main towns and cities controlled by the Palestinian Authority. They have full autonomy, they have their own full government. But unfortunately, what we see is that the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, as you mentioned earlier in the programme, the last thing they want is peace, that they're more interested in keeping this conflict alive for financial reasons, but also the indoctrination and hatred that they are giving their own people through their media, through their education system, against Israel and against the Jewish people is probably one of the biggest reasons why the two nations are not coming together.
Well, the Palestinians like to use Israel as a scapegoat because everything that goes wrong with the Palestinian people is Israel's fault. If there was peace, they won't be able to use that argument anymore, and people will judge the Palestinian leaders for what they are. And I think it will be much more difficult for them to actually manage and run a state for Palestine that will not be able to use Israel as a scapegoat for what's going wrong.
And Sammy, can you share with us the wider work of COFIS and the regional groups across Scotland and the work they're doing for Israel and also for the Jewish people? So I've got many friends, particularly the likes of those involved in the work of Highland Friends of Israel and others.
Well, there are about 10 Friends of Israel groups in Scotland. And Glasgow Friends of Israel is obviously the biggest one and the most active one, but the other ones tend to be much smaller, but they still do exist and they still support Israel. So a decision was taken to set up an umbrella organisation which is called COFIS, or Confederation of Friends of Israel in Scotland, and they tend to manage all the groups and help all the groups. And it went into a sort of decline recently, COFIS, but we're in the process of rebooting COFIS and trying to make sure that it is active and there to help some of the smaller Friends of Israel groups that exist in places like, as you say, Highland, Inverness, Forth Valley. There's lots of different groups that would like to do more, and they do need help to actually make some progress, and that's what COFIS is going to do. Excellent.
And with the work you're doing through Glasgow Friends of Israel, you've taken the streets of Glasgow back. Before it was in the hands of the Israel haters, but now you've readdressed that balance. You put on a range of excellent speaking events with kind of excellent speakers as well. Is there anything else as an organisation that you want to focus on regarding Israel, or change the argument and people's perspectives of what they see and know about Israel?
Well, one of the things I've been involved in is setting up a peace group inside the Scottish National Party. So we've established a group called SNP Friends for Peace in the Middle East. And once again, we've got Jewish people and Christian people who are involved in that group. And what we've started doing is actually attending the SNP party conferences and have a stall in the party conference, which is quite unusual to have a balanced Israel-Palestinian stall within the SNP. And so we're not actually affiliated to the SNP, but we do attend the conferences, and we hope to be there again this year in the summer when the next conference happens. And again, there's a lot of misapprehension and ignorance within the SNP about the Middle East and about what's happening in the conflict. And what we're trying to do there is the same as what we do with the GFI, tell people about the real truth about Israel and why Israel wants peace and the difficulties that it presents to some of the people living there. And we've had a very hostile reception within the SNP when we first started, but we've now been to a conference 3 or 4 times, and we've become a little bit as part of the furniture, and we get a much better reception now than we used to get when we first started out. And we feel that's very important because the SNP is the main party and it's the government of Scotland, and it's Absolutely. Important to work with them as well. And
also, it's very important, isn't it, to engage with Scottish members of Parliament
MSPs,
as well.
yes.
MSPs, and also the Scottish Parliament itself, because that's where the power is in Scotland, and of course, but your average member of the Scottish Parliament, what are their views and knowledge about Israel and about the Middle East?
There are a small number of partisan MSPs. Some are very, very, very pro-Palestinian, and some tend to be more balanced, and they see the bigger picture. And it's very disappointing to find such a large number of members of the Scottish Parliament who seem to be so ignorant about what's happening in the Middle East. And their view tends to be a little bit coloured, but again, by what they hear on the radio and what they see in the newspapers. They don't take an awful lot of time to actually find out the truth. And again, we're trying to address that by being at the conference. But some of them won't come near us because they realise that they don't want to speak to people with a balanced point of view because they want to maintain this picture of it being very pro-Palestinian. But the sad thing is that some people come to our stall or away from our stall and they say, we really support what you're doing, but we're afraid to let people know that because we're going to get so much hassle within the SNP when people find out that we tend to take a balanced point of view.
And why is it important to tell the truth about Israel to members of the Scottish Parliament so that they have an understanding? And why is Israel important to Scotland?
Well, as you know, there's a determined effort to have another referendum, independence referendum in Scotland. And although it's not going to be very soon, I expect after the 2021 Scottish elections, there'll be another very strong attempt to have another independence referendum. And it's very likely that Scotland could become independent. And if Scotland's independent, it's a sovereign country, like Israel is a sovereign country. And I would like to think that the two countries can have very close cooperation because the two countries are very similar from a population point of view, from a high-tech point of view, from other industries where, for example, oil exploration, and it's very similar in the two countries. And I'd like to think that Scotland could help Israel, and Israel can help Scotland in the future if Scotland does become independent. And that's why it's important that people in Scotland are aware of what's happening in the Middle East. And Israel is the most wonderful story that you could ever hear about a country.
Absolutely. And also what's extraordinary, I think, as well, is we have wonderful opportunities when we have kind of sporting events, whether these are kind of whether this is qualifying for the Euros or qualifying for the World Cup. And recently, Israel was paired with Scotland, I think, in the qualifying group as well. And Scottish fans themselves got the first taste of what it's like to have and receive Israeli hospitality, which I'm sure went down really well. It
did go down very well. And in fact, in March, Scotland is playing Israel again. There's going to be another match between the two countries, and I'm looking forward to going to that. And it's difficult for me to say who I want to win because I'm Israeli and I'm Scottish. But from my point of view, I hope it's a wonderful game and the best team wins.
Absolutely. And Simon, there are so many Christian supporters of Israel up in Scotland, and maybe many of them haven't got involved in the regional groups such as Glasgow Friends of Israel. So what would you say to those watching that actually want to participate? They want to show their love and support and solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people. What difference can they make, and what can they do as being part of these regional groups across Scotland?
Well, firstly, you'll be pleased to hear that people that come to our stall in Glasgow come from all over the place. They don't just come from Glasgow. People come from Edinburgh, people come from the East Coast to participate and take part in our stall every Saturday. But there are regional groups which work to help Israel and assist Israel. And if people want to know how to get in touch with them, again, if they contact me on our normal Glasgow Friends of Israel email address, which maybe we can put up at the end, I will help them find the local group, and they can work with them as often and as happily as they would like to be. And I think there's much they can do.
And can you share with us, Sammy, personally, why you've taken this leadership on yourself, and what Israel means to you, to the extent that you are willing to kind of sacrifice near enough every Saturday to be out in the streets of Glasgow, to tell the truth about Israel, to to actually build a stronger relationship with the Christian community. And I've been to your conferences, and I've seen the type of people that are very much involved in Glasgow Friends of Israel, and they're very special people, especially your wife Vicky as well, and she's very warm. And you know, this shows you the real Israel, doesn't it, and the real people of Israel. Why is this so important?
I think before we started Glasgow Friends of Israel, we did not realise there was such enormous support from Christians to Israel and how much they love Israel. And I think having the stall and having the group has given our Christian friends an opportunity to come out and express their love for Israel. And I think that in itself is a wonderful thing to do. But we started out just after the 2014 Gaza war, where the PR in the UK was so anti-Israel, it wasn't true. And we felt it was very, very important to have a presence on the street to let people know the truth about Israel and what happened in the last 70 years. And that's why we started out. And our group has gone from strength to strength now. And on a Saturday afternoon, we can have 14, 16 members of our group standing in Buchanan Street, and we have a party. It's so wonderful, and so many people stop, and it's the most wonderful atmosphere that we experience. And it's turned out that this is such an important piece of work that we've spoken to literally thousands of people in Glasgow about what's happening in the Middle East. And if only a tiny percentage of them believe what we say and actually become more interested in what's happening in the Middle East, that's going to be a job well done as far as we're concerned.
Absolutely. And it's also important that people get a perspective of Israel that is different from the mainstream news coverage of Israel. And this very much taints people's perceptions. But how can you encourage people, maybe our viewers, that have never been to Israel, to actually go to Israel and see Israel for themselves?
Well, Israel is one of the most interesting countries in the world. If you're very religious, obviously there's a real reason to go to Israel and actually see the places that are described in the Bible. And you can actually go to the Jordan River. You can actually go to Jerusalem. You can go to all these places that people learned about when they were young in school. And also, if you want a holiday, there's nowhere better to go than Israel, because there's such a variety of places to visit. And I think when people go to Israel, it completely opens their eyes to the kind of country it is. And we say to people, the only way to find out what Israel is like is to go there. And we would encourage as many people as possible to go there and visit and see it for themselves.
And Simon, what's Israel like for you, knowing that you were born in the kind of mandate period before the creation of the state? And when you go back, what is it like to go back and then see the kind of transformation that the nation of Israel has gone through over the past 70 plus years?
Well, one thing I need to say is I'm not sure if I'm an Israeli Scot or a Scottish Israeli, but I am half and half as far as that's concerned. And I try and go back to Israel as often as I can. One is because I've still got family there. And secondly, when I went back to Israel when I was older and I spent 5 years in the IDF, I made lots of the most wonderful friends who I still see when I go back. So it's going back to my original home and my original family and my original friends. And I do that as often as I can. And from that point of view, you can't beat a visit to Israel. And in fact, I'm going back in May this year with my wife, Vicky.
Excellent. And one thing that is so important to mention when it comes to Israel, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's the only nation in the Middle East that has democratic institutions such as a kind of free press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all these cherished values that we take for granted, but they're not so in the rest of the region. Why do you think Israel has such a hard time in communicating the incredible values that the nation of Israel holds and represents, and that Israel is such an open and diverse society?
One of the reasons we started Glasgow Friends of Israel is because we recognize that the PR job that Israel is doing is not adequate. It's just not good enough. And that's the reason there is so much ignorance about the country, about its people, about its democracy, and everything to do with the country. And that's why we stand in the street to try and let people know what it's about. And it's disappointing that Israel is the most wonderful country with fantastic people, and yet they cannot do a very good PR as far as the country is concerned. And I think that's a real cause of the problems that we have with Israel from a picture point of view of what people think about the country.
Excellent. And so we're down to 5 minutes of the programme left, and I really want to use this time and this opportunity to encourage you all, if you're up in Scotland, to get involved in the work of these great organisations such as Glasgow, Friends of Israel, and others right across the nation of Scotland. And it's important, isn't it, that the Christians get involved. They don't just sit on the sofas, but they actually participate in, for example, the Stand Up to Racism march that you've got coming up on Saturday, the 21st of March. And also to make a difference, because it's so important that people speak up for truth, they speak up for Israel, and they speak up for the love that God's given them for Israel and the Jewish people.
As I said before, Simon, we could not operate, we could not work without the assistance and support we get from our Christian friends. And we are one community. We are one community with what I call a heart for Israel. And they're there on the street with us every week, and we all do a very similar job. We tell people what a wonderful place Israel is and why it should be supported, because it is the only democracy in the Middle East. It is the only place that people can worship in peace, and the only place with women's rights, workers' rights, and people are free to do what they want to do. And that does not happen in any other part of the Middle East.
Absolutely. But also it's so important in terms of Israel's innovation, in terms of technology, the way that Israel is helping the kind of continent with Africa, dealing with the issues of famine, dealing with the issue of water shortages, and something about the Jewish heart that just wants to make the world a kind of better place. And that is the true nature and the character of the modern state of Israel.
Well, you know, Israel is called the startup nation because there are so many new companies that get established in Israel, and many of them are high-tech companies. And one thing that really amuses me is when people talk about BDS and boycott everything that comes out of Israel, they forget that the phones they use are probably designed or manufactured in Israel. They forget that the laptops they're using has a large part to do with Israel, and yet they're quite happy to keep those, but they try and stop people buying Israeli food or Israeli products, and yet they're real hypocrites by sticking to keeping these devices while preaching for BDS in Israel.
Absolutely. And Sammy, do you have a message for our viewers to encourage them to attend the March Against Racism that you've got planned for Saturday, the 21st of March in Glasgow?
Well, we expect to be well protected by the police this year. I've had a meeting with police in Glasgow to make sure that that's going to be in place, and they've committed to that. And so I'm hoping that people will not be afraid to come out, and they would love to participate in the march, which is all about anti-racism. It's not even to some extent about Israel, it's more to do with anti-Semitism, and I think every single one of us should be able to stand up and fight anti-Semitism.
Absolutely, because with anti-Semitism, what starts with the Jewish people never finishes with the Jewish people. And if you don't stand up for the Jewish people, then our whole society is in peril, and that's why it's essential that we stand up for Israel and the Jewish people. Also, according to the Bible, Genesis 12, I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. Yeah. And the majority of people would sooner have a blessing from God rather than an actual curse from God. And that's another reason to support Israel and the Jewish people. Sammy, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report, and thank you for the excellent work you do up in Glasgow in giving Israel and the Jewish people a voice, and the excellent speakers you have, as well as your commitment to having that weekly store on a Saturday in Buchanan Street in Glasgow.
Thank you very much, Simon, and I'd like to come back another time to tell you what's going on with our group.
Absolutely. So thank you for giving us an update. I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. It's so important that as Christians we show support and solidarity to Israel and the Jewish people. And if you're living up in Scotland, which is a great nation, I've been there many times, it's so important that you get involved with these regional groups such as Glasgow Friends of Israel, that you show your love and support. And if you're in Glasgow, please go and say hello to Sammy. So it's important to be involved in this work and show that practical love and support for Israel and the Jewish people. And we'll leave you with this beautiful song that just is the very heart of what we stand for, and that is to stand for the city of Jerusalem.
שבויה בחלומה, העיר אשר בדד יושבת ובליבה חומה. ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושל אור, הלא לכל שירייך אני כינור. ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושל אור, הלא לכל שירייך אני כינור. חזרנו אל בורות המים, לשוק ולכיכר, שופר קורא בהר הבית, בעיר העתיקה, ובמרות אשר בסלע, אלפי שמשות זורחות, ושוב נרד לים המלח בדרך יריחו. ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושל אור, הלא לכל שירייך אני כינור. ירושלים של זהב ושל נחושת ושל אור, הלא לכל שירייך אני אך בבואי היום לשיר לך ולך לקשור כתרים, קטונתי מצעיר בנייך ומאחרון המשוררים.